On today's World Insight, China and Iran ink a 25-year agreement during Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Iran. How will this deal reshape the Middle East? And a yawning divide between wealthy and poor countries over vaccination efforts, with zero vaccine rollout among the poorest nations. Could China-U.S. cooperation help bridge the global COVID vaccination divide? The virus hunter Ian Lipkin with some answers.
This is one world that needs to work together. Everybody must be protected. Everybody must be monitored, and everybody must contribute to the control of infectious diseases.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The State Councilor and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi started his Iran visit over the weekend, the third stop of his six-state Middle East tour. During his two-day visit there, Wang Yi and his Iranian counterparts exchanged views on strengthening bilateral relations. China welcomes the intention expressed by the new U.S. administration to return to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Wang added that safeguarding the deal is safeguarding multilateralism. Also on Saturday, the two countries inked a 25-year cooperation agreement covering political and economic areas. The Middle East tour follows Wang Yi's whirlwind week of diplomatic meetings with U.S. senior diplomats in Alaska and with his Russian counterpart in South China's Guilin. So what peace broker role could China play in the region? Let's loop in our panelists. What does it mean, that 25-year deal with Iran? For Chinese Foreign Minister's visit to Iran, in Tehran, we have Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University. In Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland, the senior fellow and the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at Independent Institute. And in Xi'an, China, Wang Jin, associate professor from Northwest University of China. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. I want to start by asking you, Professor Marandi, a very fruitful list of achievements.
Yes, I think it is quite significant. The agreement is a roadmap where the two sides have come together and worked out how to develop their mutual relationship, how to expand it. And it's a long-term relationship that they are looking at. Obviously, roadmaps are the general framework in which things will be developed, and there will be further discussions about different elements within the framework of this roadmap. But the very fact that the two countries have the will and the understanding that they need to develop further ties to strengthen the bond between East and West Asia and to develop their own economies as a result, I think that's a major step forward.
Professor Marandi, if I could just very briefly follow up, what do you think are the circumstances that make this cooperation so possible now?
I think there are a number of things. Both countries are highly independent. They make their own decisions. Their decisions are not made in Washington or anywhere else. China is a very powerful country with a very strong economy. Iran is a very powerful country that has major influence in West Asia. And Iran, of course, has oil and gas. China needs a large amount of oil and gas.
Yes.
And of course, when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, Iran plays a major role for China, and the initiative is very important for Iran as well. Both countries want to develop an Asian network in order to facilitate trade and development and to strengthen their economies.
Professor Wang Jin, I'm sure from Xi'an, which is almost the starting point from China, the Belt and Road, also at the ancient times, looking at the deal right now, what do you think made it possible?
I think many factors. For example, from the historical factors, that the friendship between China and Iran can be traced back to 1,000 years ago. Well, if we look at the political way, as just Professor Marandi suggested, that China and Iran, we trust each other, we are good friends, and we hope can further develop this type in the future. And if you look at the economic factors, and in recent years, especially during the past decades, in China and Iran, our economic ties enhance, and our cooperations in, for example, a lot of energy, not only concentrated on energy, but also the finance, but also the investment also developed. Although we have some difficulties, yes, that's for sure. But I think the future is of the prospect between the bilateral ties will be very, very broad, will be very, very positive.
It's a very practical one, I have to say, at this point. But Professor Wang, China probably also needs to bear in mind that there are unilateral sanctions against Iran from some countries, such as the United States. So how would that work? Because the new administration coming into power, promising to make a difference, but not yet to lift those sanctions.
I want to say here is that, first of all, China and Iran, and also the most states in the international society, we believe that the sanctions should be lifted. I think we all have the belief that in the future, that this difficulty can be overcome, this difficulty can be bridged. And on the other hand, I think China and Iran, this deal, if you look at it, it's a very longer term deal. It's about 25 years later. So nobody knows what will happen tomorrow. Nobody knows maybe what will happen 5 years later. Maybe the geopolitics in the region will be transformed, and the ties between the Tehran and Washington can be improved. So we are doing here is look at the future. We are doing here is trying to plan a very new map for the bilateral ties between China and Iran the next 25 years and next one quarter of the century.
New map, that's what Mr. Wang are suggesting from China. Mr. Eland, what does that new map mean or could mean for Washington?
You know, the United States under the Trump administration, I think ill-advisedly withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and put, pretty significant sanctions against Iran. And I think this gives Iran a way to, have another source of exporting oil, et cetera. And it also, of course, gives, on the other hand, gives China a market and perhaps cheaper labor in some cases. So I think it's beneficial for both those countries. But for the United States, I think, if the United States continues on the policy of both, of course, China and Iran, I think that it will fail, because I think Iran at least has a little bit more leverage. But I think, it's in everybody's interest, China, the United States, and Iran, to get Iran and the U.S. back into the nuclear deal.
True.
And I think that will eventually happen. Iran-U.S. relations may improve somewhat, and China and the U.S. relations may improve somewhat, but I think there's still going to be some antagonism to both countries on the part of the new administration, maybe not as much as the old administration of Trump, but certainly you'll see some improvement, but still some issues.
I see a lot of edges rather than improvements so far as we speak, but who knows what's next. Having said that, though, Professor Morandi, oil is still a big factor of Iran's economy. And also, as we are seeing, global supply chains might be in the future experiencing quite some dramatic changes. That's what we have seen from, for example, from the issue of cotton. Professor Morandi, how do you see this relationship, the changing, possibly evolving relationship between China and Iran?
A blockage in the Suez Canal, and which shows how easily global supply changes can be affected. And one of the important things about the Road and Belt Initiative that is being promoted by the Chinese government is that it is much more reliant on roads, on developing trade and networks in Asia itself. It is also focused on sea trade as well, but it is more balanced, and therefore less reliant, and less trade is less easily threatened by events on the high seas, whether it is just some simple blockage like what we just now saw, or some form of hostility that could take place. So I think that's one important thing, in both Iran being in West Asia and China being in East Asia, and Central Asian countries being in between. This initiative is both fruitful for the development of West China northern Iran and the whole Central Asian region, and it makes these countries less reliant on sea trade. In addition to that, while the U.S. has imposed very strong sanctions, as you alluded to earlier, because of the increasing demand, as we see right now, Iranian oil is being exported almost to full capacity, whereas a year and a half ago, it had gone down very much. And again, the Chinese need larger sources for energy. They need more diverse sources of energy because they are rapidly growing, even though they are arguably the first, or I mean, they could be the first or the second largest economy in the world, depending on how you calculate things. But it's not only an issue of energy, it's also the fact that Iran is a huge market. China is the greatest market in the world, being the most populated country. And Iran has very powerful alliances across West Asia, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Yemen, Afghanistan. And therefore, if you include its allies, that is potentially a much larger market than Iran itself. And Iran is a very highly educated country. It doesn't take orders from Washington. If the United States would tell a particular country to decrease trade with China or to decrease oil sales to China, some of them may be easily influenced. So and again, for Iran, the same is true with China. China is not a country that will just take a phone call from some Western capital and change its policy. It's a strong and independent country. And therefore, for all these different reasons, this agreement it will be quite useful. And it's really sad that the United States is antagonizing Iran, China, and all these other countries, rather than taking advantage of opportunities that exist in this very volatile era that we live in.
It seems that the U.S. has been taking some new initiatives regarding the Middle East, for example, about the issue of Yemen, about Afghanistan, but this new administration could hardly move with all the priorities. It is struggling back at home. But the question is, how much space does it leave to China in the Middle East, including its relationship with Iran? Earlier, Professor Morandi was talking about Iran building a good friendship with some of the neighboring countries. But how mature is that if it could be a potential market for China?
China still plays a very active, very constructive role in this region. We want to be the bridge of connecting the different countries. We want to be the bridge of trying to melt down this crisis in this region, like the cases between Saudi Arabia and Iran that China wants to develop directly with them. And then we hope in the future there will be the very big market, the big opportunities that can bring everybody together to melt down these things. We believe that all the hatred, all the distrust resulted from the past. But if we look at the future, more opportunities might emerge, and all these opportunities will bring everybody together to melt down, to settle this crisis. I think
is it possible, Professor Morandi?
Well, I think there's great possibility. First of all, a lot of the trade would be taking place through Central Asia, and both Iran and China have very good relations with their Central Asian neighbors, as well as with Russia. And of course, there's Afghanistan. And to the west of Iran, there's Turkey and Iraq, which also have very good relations with Iran and China. The real issue that you are alluding to is Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative would be inclusive to all these countries in the region. And the Iranian and Chinese development does not impede Chinese Saudi Arabian relations. Iran, under no circumstances, would demand China change its relationship with the Saudis. These developments and the agreement between Iran and China are the future. And we have to see what happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the future. Hopefully, the war in Yemen will come to an end. And in future, we will see growth in this region go back to a place where people can rise out of poverty. And China and Iran can benefit from this together.
Mr. Yeland, The other two gentlemen are talking about an area in which the U.S. used to consider as extremely strategically important for various reasons. But now there seems to be less interest for the U.S., curiosity at least, about that region. So, Mr. Yilan, how should we understand the role of China now in that region? And how should we understand the acceptance of the U.S. to play a different role in the region as it used to be, compared to it used to be?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between military power and economic power. And certainly the U.S. has been involved in both, but, you know, we've been in two, well, actually, if you count Libya, 3 big wars in the Middle Eastern area. And I think people in the United States are a bit sick of that. And I think, so they're trying to de-emphasize the Middle East, and at least the Pentagon is, and they're trying to increase attention to near peer competitors or even peer competitors now with Russia and China. So, and we see, I think China actually is probably pursuing a better strategy than the U.S. because it's more economically oriented, and therefore, you know, they're more interested in economics in the Middle East. I think you're seeing that with this agreement. So the United States is refocusing itself, although it still can't seem to get out of places that it's been for many years militarily. Yeah. So I think, you know, I'm not sure the Chinese strategy is completely perfect, but it seems to be better than the United States. And I think, you know, this idea of sanctions on oil has never worked, didn't work in the 1973 oil embargo, and it doesn't work in reverse when the U.S. tries to do it. And also the United States also gets caught up in the Israeli and Gulf states versus Iran political and military thing, and I don't think China does. So I think China is probably better off for that as well and concentrating on the economics.
The other thing is about JCPOA. Now, that has been something long overdue in terms of seeking solutions. Professor Morandi, is it time? In that regard, what will be China's role? And how do you think Iran, China, with this 25-year strategic deal, likely to assess JCPOA in a different light?
Well, I think both Iran and China see the JCPOA very similarly, in that it is a deal which must be applied in full, and that all sides must fully implement their obligations. And the United States never did that. Under Obama, they only partially fulfilled their obligations, whereas the Iranians fulfilled all of theirs. And of course, we know what happened under Trump. So what the Iranians are saying now is that, look, we want the deal to be implemented in full. It benefits everyone. The questions, whether legitimate or illegitimate, about Iran's peaceful nuclear program can be dealt with easily this way. And of course, the pressure that the Americans are putting on ordinary Iranians will be swept aside if the deal is implemented. But the problem is that since the United States does not have a history of implementation, and the Americans have damaged the Iranian economy immensely by tearing the deal, the Iranians are saying, look, you cannot ask us to begin implementation, whereas you're the side that exited the deal, and we stayed in even after you left. So you have to show that you are serious about implementation, right, and that the United States can do this. The Iranians can flip a switch and easily turn off parts of its nuclear program, but the Americans have to show that they are going to allow, for example, the banking sector to function, and that is a process. So the Iranians are saying, first show that you're honest, and then we'll do what we need to do.
Right. Professor Wang, from China's perspective, with this strategic 25-year deal with Iran, how is the country looking at JCPOA and every step of the way to implement the earlier plan in a different light?
I think the JCPOA is from China's perspective, is the very achievement of the efforts from international society. Is the achievement that should be respected, should be maintained. But right now, the stalemate is that both Iran and the United States, they believe that each other the other side should move first. And they believe that all the things that today should be blamed by the other side. So that is here the stalemate come from. I think China can do something that maybe can be the bridge for the connection together with the other partners of the JCPOA, and also the China can show its confidence just as this the 25-year deal to show that China is still very confident about the JCPOA's maintenance and about the future prospect of the Iran's ties with this world. Under the circumstances, especially the sanctions from the United States, it's very, very difficult or even impossible for China to implement the very realistic, very, very in-depth cooperation with Iran directly, given the sanctions, especially over the financial sectors and energy sectors. It's very hard. So that's why we are looking at future rather than now. It's a roadmap we're talking about 25 years later, not just nowadays.
The U.S. does play a huge role in whether JCPOA can be implemented or not. In the first presser given by the president, we didn't hear much about that at all. Earlier with Secretary Blinken, we didn't hear much either about how JCPOA will be implemented. Professor Morandi said the U.S. is expecting Iran to take all the first steps, but Iran has already taken first steps, but didn't get any good response from the U.S. So the ball seemed to be kicked into the court of Washington. Is it going to have a good player on the ground?
Well, I think that the Biden administration does have the intention of getting back into it and, going forward with some other agreement in the future. The problem, of course, is both sides want the other side to go first, and Iran does have some valid complaints against the United States, but I think pragmatically, both countries are probably going to have to take, baby steps along the way to get because neither side trusts each other. So in a practical sense, whose fault it is probably not going to make much difference, because I think what they're going to do is eventually, I think they probably will get to a deal, but I think they're going to, posture both sides, and they're also going to have to take confidence building steps along the way because there's been so much bad blood between the two.
Professor Morandi, Iran experienced something that nobody else has ever experienced before. It was once very much connected with the rest of the world, also with the Western world. But as a result of historical reasons, it became what it is today. Now, we also see some Cold War mentality, zero-sum game mentality in the West these days about ideology, using human rights as an issue to divide the world. Professor Morandi, when you look at what is going on right now, to you as an Iranian expert, what are some of the takeaways you have from history? I'm personally and intellectually extremely interested in this.
I think that the biggest problem that exists between Iran and the United States is that the United States never respected Iran as a sovereign and independent country. And before the revolution, Iran was subservient to the United States. And that was a humiliation, just like it is for many other countries in our region and other parts of the world today. And the revolution itself was an expression of that anger and an intention to become independent. The problem is that after the revolution, the United States refused to accept this new state of affairs. If the Americans had accepted that, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. The United States and Iran would continue to have relations, though it would no longer be a relationship of a subservient country or a client regime to the United States. It would be between two partners that treat each other equally. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Iranians and the Chinese were able to come to this agreement, because this agreement is not about one side playing a more important role or a decision-making role and the other side basically following the orders. No, it's two independent countries, two countries that respect each other's sovereignty, and as a result, they're able to look far into the future for their relationship. So if the United States continues down this road, and it's now not only doing this to Iran, it's beginning to show the same hostility towards China, towards Russia, is constantly sanctioning different countries. Even the Indians are being threatened for doing military trade with the Russians. If the United States continues to go down this road, ultimately it's going to be harming itself more than everyone else, and it's going to bring other countries together as a result.
Very interesting situation we're facing today. We'll see how things evolve. This is a very exciting time, but we hope the politicians are making decisions with responsibilities in their mind. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us. Mohammad Marandi from Iran, Ivan Eland from the US, and Wang Yi from China. Thank you so much.